Okay. Thank you. Before I ask members to ask questions, I've been debating that too. I mean, one of the reasons I ran for office when I was a bureaucrat and elected officials would make laws, and then they would force me to make it happen. And sometimes I didn't get enough money, didn't enough resources, and like I always say, sometimes it was just a stupid idea, but I had to make it happen. Obviously, we can't go back in time, but it sounds like there's some things we probably can do now. But for example, the young lady was mentioning about the courts and some of the things we needed to think ahead of time, especially if the marijuana laws go into effect. We really should ask the people who are on the ground how that will impact you and what you will need, so that we're asking, like you're saying, we probably should be asking for resources or planning for resources ahead of time, so that if the law goes in, we can hit the ground running. We're not waiting another year or another 9 years like we did with the medical marijuana law. We had to wait another 9 years before me and several of my colleagues were able to put in the regulations for that. So what would you suggest right now, if you had one or two things that maybe we could start working on now to probably put in place, so that I don't want to say soften, so that we can make the law better, and so that the transition as we move over will be a lot better? Is there any one or two things that we might be able to do?
You can make the savings calculations transparent and consistent, so that from one year to another, everybody knows, even if it's a competitive pot, mm-hmm. at least everyone knows the size of the pot going in. So you can, every municipalities and counties and regions can plan on what resources are going to be available. The other thing about competitive pots is state has lots of competitive pots for transportation and lots of other things. We know if this third of the state gets it this year, then the following year another third of the state moves into a more competitive position, and so on and so forth. But again, if you have no idea what it's going to be when you start, in a county or a city, you might not even dedicate resources to be prepared for the competition when it comes around. And then, when it comes around, you're not prepared. All of a sudden, you're not competitive again. So I think, again, transparency and consistency is the most foundational and important thing you can do.
Thank you.
And I'd just like to add that I represent low-income people, so I speak for them. And for us, the biggest issue is identification of the eligible offenses, so that we can have those folks served and get the savings, get them out of prison, get them off probation, and divert those resources. So identification, getting access to rap sheets, getting access to the information would be the biggest thing for me, so we can get that process started. Thank you.
Okay. Anyone else? Okay.
To me, I just think it's educating the community, kind of what she said, like to be able to know that they qualify for these services. So so many people don't even know that they even qualify for a reduction. And so I think a lot of times what they ask us in the community coalition is, have you seen? Well, I think that it should be billboards, or the outreach and engagement to inform the community should be there. And I think that would speed up the process of people knowing that they actually do qualify.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Lackey, do you have any questions?
When the panel comes back up.
For the LAO and okay. So I want to thank each of you for being here today. It was informative, and I think we definitely know what the need is and how we need to move forward. And so I would like to ask the Department of Finance and LAO's office to come back. Hello. Hi. So let's this time begin once more people. We begin with the Department of Finance. I guess with a discussion of
Thank you.
methodology used to calculate savings, and then we'll have the LAO talk about options for calculating savings. So whoever wants to begin on the Department of Finance side.
All right. Clint Kellum, Department of Finance. So there's a couple things that I just want to lay out in principle that come from the initiative language itself as far as the calculation goes. By July 31st, 2016, the Director of Finance shall determine the savings accrued to the state related to implementation of Proposition 47, and then annually thereafter. The calculation in the initiative it specifies that the comparison should be to fiscal year 2013-14, and in this case to 2015-16, and that year would change in future years as we move on. The calculation is supposed to use actual data or best data available to determine what savings accrued from the state, and then once the calculation has been finalized and certified to the controller, it shouldn't change regardless of underlying data changes at that point. So more broadly, the $29.3 million that's currently estimated to be the savings that accrued in 15-16 is a net calculation. There's cost and savings. Oh.
So they can hear you. Can bring
Sorry.
it a little closer.
Sorry, I'll pull this a little closer. So it's a net calculation. $29.3 million is estimated. The first piece of that is there's two cost components. $27 million is attributed to the court resentencing piece. Again, that was laid out earlier by the LMO, and there was some discussion related to offenders in custody or on supervision that are resentenced from a felony to a misdemeanor, and then also those people being categorized as a felon or a misdemeanor for prior felony offenses. There's also $6.5 million related to parole costs that wouldn't have been actualized without Prop 47. Most of these offenders, because their current offense was non-serious, non-violent, would have gone to post-release community supervision, and they ended up going on to parole because that's what the initiative had laid out. Then we get into the savings piece. There's $52 million related to the reduced inmate population and the reduced cost to CDCR's budget. There's $8.7 million related to reduction in the Department of State Hospitals budget for fewer offenders being eligible because their felony offense was now misdemeanor, so there was fewer people on that needed incompetent to stand trial treatment, and then about $2 million in reduced savings to the court from the recategorization of certain felonies to misdemeanors, which then drives a reduced workload. So all of those factors kind of lay out the basis for the $29.3 million, and then I think I think the piece that people tend to be most interested in is the state savings related to the inmate population. And there's a couple pieces here that are probably most important. So there's the state contract bed rate, which we estimated about $29,000. And then there's the actual corrections in prison marginal rate, which is around $9,300. So those are the two factors that we are adjusting for on budgetarily to kind of adjust the department's budget as population changes. So what we looked at here is, again, using best data or actual data to see what, in fact, actually affected the department's budget since the implementation of Prop 47. And that's a complicated question because Prop 47 occurred at a similar time that there were other population reduction measures going on. Actually, over that period of time, we think the effects are in 15-16 related to those measures and Prop 47 are about 8,700 inmates. So of that amount, Prop 47 is about 4,700, so 54%. So that's an important number to keep track of, that 54%. And then we said, okay, so if we're trying to attribute what savings has reduced from the state since that point, what should be counted at the contract bed rate and what should be counted at the in-state prison rate. So we looked at how many contract beds have been reduced since 13-14, as the calculation laid out, and the state had reduced about 820 contract beds on average since 2013-14. We applied that again, because we didn't know what, in fact, allowed us to reduce the 820 beds since there was multiple population reduction measures going on at the same time. We said we'll apply the percentage of Prop 47 on a proportional basis to that reduction. That led us to about 444 inmates being calculated at the contract bed rate, and the remaining amount being captured at the in-prison marginal rate. So that's sort of the underlying data here for how the state calculated savings on a general net level, and then more specifically as it relates to the CDCR component, which I think is most discussed.
Okay. Is anyone else finance? So I have a quick question. It's more of and unfortunately the controller's office is not here, and if we thought it through, but you were reading something, and you mentioned that the controller has some participation in the calculation. Is it to verify the number, making sure you added the numbers up right? Is it to verify whether or not the algorithm you use was something that made sense? I have Ms. Nora Campos here, where the former controller, decided that she shouldn't get her pay, and it went to court. And so sometimes a controller can make determinations far and above what some people think. What is your interpretation of what they're supposed to do when you came up with your number that they're supposed to, I guess, verify by August? What is their role? So,
and probably misspoke, the director of finance certifies to the controller that this is the actual savings, and then the controller's mechanism is that they transfer the money from the general fund into the Safe Neighborhoods Fund.
So they don't
really have
do any
oversight on
they don't
that
have any
calculation.
oversight.
We're certifying to them that this is the final calculation to be transferred, in the amount to be transferred from the general fund.
If I could also add, Amy Jarvis with Department of Finance, the Controller's Office does have an audit requirement. So in 17-18, I believe, is when their first audit will be conducted to confirm and verify that all of the funds have been accounted for appropriately. So I think we might have some more information then, which may influence the future outcome of the Department of Finance's calculation, but not initially.
So you think they may also make determination on the algorithm or what the methodology that you used when they do the audit? Is that what you're saying?
I would presume that there is maybe some component of that. I don't think they've completely defined what their audit will look like, but potentially they could have some role then.
Okay, thank you. And now the LAO.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to be providing an overview of our recent report on meeting the fiscal requirements of Proposition 47. I prepared a handout for you today that looks like this. It should be in front of you now. It's entitled Fiscal Impacts of Proposition 47. This summarizes the key points we make in our recently released report. Before I get into the details, I'll just let you know the bottom line, which has been stated earlier today. We think that the savings from Proposition 47 may be around $100 million or so, more than the administration is currently estimating. So with that, if you'll turn to the first page of your handout, it's actually labeled page 2. I'll provide an overview of some of the fiscal requirements of the measure. We have already covered the first couple of bullets here, but I would like to note one thing on this page, which is that the measure really doesn't lay out an explicit formula for how to make the calculations of the savings from the measure, or how to pay for the deposit into the special fund. As such, there really is no one perfect, correct way to do it. It is a somewhat subjective process. So with that point in mind, if you turn to page 3 of your handout, we provide a framework for how we think the legislature may want to approach meeting the fiscal requirements of the measure. So we think there are really two key questions here. One is how to estimate the amount of the deposit into the special fund, and the second being how to adjust program budgets to pay for that deposit. And in answering these questions, we were really guided by one key principle, which is that we believe the overall intent of Proposition 47 is to have no net impact on state expenditures. So regarding that first question of how to determine the amount of the deposit, we think that the most reasonable method is to identify any savings to state programs in the prior fiscal year and then subtract out any cost to the state of implementing the measure in that same year. So in other words, really focusing on the net savings in only that prior fiscal year. In terms of the second question on how to pay for that deposit, we think the approach that makes the most sense and is the most transparent is for the legislature to reduce the budgets for programs that realize savings under the measure, and then on the other hand, make augmentations to program budgets when they incur costs under the measure, and that the net difference between those two, the net savings, would be used to pay for the deposit into the special fund, which would result in no net impact to the general fund. If you'll turn to page 4 of the handout, we provide a table summarizing the administration's estimates of the fiscal impacts to the state of Prop 47. I think Department of Finance did a pretty good job of summarizing what those are, so I won't go into great detail. I would just note that the bottom line is that the administration is estimating $29 million, $29.3 million to be specific, will be deposited into the Safe Neighborhoods and Schools Fund for expenditure in 16-17. Overall, we think that the administration is likely underestimating the savings from the measure and also overestimating the costs of implementing the measure in some areas. In addition, we find that the administration did not account for all costs and savings within the specific fiscal year in which they occur. With that, if you'll turn to page 5 of your handout, I will get into the main area of savings and why we think that main area, the prison savings, is being underestimated by the administration. So there are really kind of two key assumptions that need to be made to make an estimate of the savings from the measure to the prison system. The first is how many inmates are not coming to state prison because of Proposition 47. The administration has estimated about 4,700 inmates are not coming to prison in 15-16 because of Proposition 47. And we think that's a reasonable estimate. It's in line with what we estimated when we looked at this initiative and did our analysis in prior years. The second area, the second key assumption, and this is where we disagree with the administration, is about how much savings to associate with that population reduction. And as Mr. Cullum from Department of Finance noted, there are kind of two key issues here. How many inmates were taken out of the state's prisons, the 34 state prisons, because of the measure, and how many contract beds were avoided because of the measure. So the administration is estimating about 400 contract beds were avoided because of the measure, and about 4,300 inmates were taken out of the state prisons because of the measure. The reason that assumption is very important is because, as was noted, the cost of those contract beds is $29,000. But when we take an inmate out of the state prisons, we only save about $9,000. So the assumption about how we split that, the reductions between contract beds and the state prisons, really drives the savings estimate. So another way to look at the administration's assumptions about how that population reduction is split is that you could say that the approach sort of implies that had the measure not passed, that the state would have avoided about 400 contract beds, or I'm sorry, the state would have had to go out and get 400 additional contract beds to accommodate inmates that would have been coming to state prison. And that the balance of the population, that 4,300, would have had to be added to the state's 34 prisons. We think that that assumption is unrealistic, and the reason we think it's unrealistic is because the state is currently operating under a court-imposed population cap. And right now we're pretty close to that cap. We're, in fact, about 900 inmates below that cap. So if we had taken the approach that the administration's estimate implies and tried to add 4,300 inmates to the state prison had this measure not passed, that would have resulted in the state exceeding the federal court-imposed cap by about 3,400 inmates. We think that's a rather unlikely scenario. The state has gone to great lengths to violating the population cap, and violating it would have triggered the court conducting early releases of inmates. So we think a lot more realistic scenario is that the state would have maintained a similar population in the state's 34 prisons, along with a similar cushion against that population cap in 15-16. And that alternative assumption would yield a savings estimate that's about $80 million higher than what the administration has estimated. Now, if you'll turn to page 6 of the handout, I'll talk about the second area where we think the administration may be underestimating savings, and that relates to the state courts. So by reducing felonies to misdemeanors, Proposition 47 results in more cases being filed as misdemeanors rather than felonies. In order to estimate how this would affect the courts, the administration made two key assumptions. First, they assumed that the measure would result in about 80,000 fewer felony cases in the state. They also assumed that it would result in about 74,000 additional misdemeanor cases. And so a net reduction of about 6,000 cases total. The second assumption they made was that the misdemeanor cases and the felony cases cost the same amount to process. So as a result, the administration's estimate that the courts will save about $1.7 million in 15-16 is based solely on that net reduction of 6,000 cases. However, we note that the judicial branch's existing workload studies show that misdemeanor cases take significantly less time on average to process than do felony cases. The administration, however, has not accounted for any difference in the cost of shifting these felony cases to misdemeanors. As such, we think that the administration's court savings estimate could be underestimated by about $10 million or more. As such, we're recommending that the legislature direct the judicial branch to provide an updated calculation of these savings using an average case processing time for felonies and misdemeanors to account for the difference in the resources required to process these cases. If you'll turn to the 7th page of your handout, I'll talk about the other area where we have some disagreements with the administration's estimates, and that is related to costs. There are really three issues here, and all three relate to the courts. The first issue is that the administration's estimate includes some court costs that were incurred in 14-15. Of the $26.9 million in costs that the administration has identified, we find that about $25 million of that is related to resentencing workload that actually occurred in 2014-15 and thus should not have been included in an estimate of the 15-16 fiscal impacts. The second issue is we think the administration has excluded some costs that they should have actually included, and that relates to about $14 million in additional resentencing and reclassification workload that occurred in 15-16 that wasn't part of the administration's estimate. And then the third issue is we think that the administration likely overestimates the court costs related to reclassifications. The administration basically assumes that resentencing cases and reclassification cases cost the same amount to process. But in fact, the initial data from the judicial branch suggests that the resentencing cases are actually requiring more resources than the reclassification cases. So the net effect of all of these three factors is that we think the overall cost estimate from the administration may be about $10 million too high for 15-16. As such, we're recommending that the judicial branch provide an updated cost calculation to reflect the difference in the amount of resources required to process resentencing and reclassification petitions. And then if you'll turn to the last page of your handout, page 8, I'll get now to the second question I identified at the outset, which is how to pay for the deposit into the Safe Neighborhoods and Schools Fund. So the administration is proposing to allow the judicial branch to keep the $1.7 million that they're estimated to save under the measure, and for the Department of Hospitals to keep the $9 million it's estimated to save from Prop 47. In our view, this would reduce legislative oversight because it allows those agencies to redirect the savings for other programs and services that haven't been reviewed or approved by the legislature. So our recommendation is that the legislature instead reduce the budgets for the courts and for the Department of State hospitals to reflect that they've achieved savings. This would increase transparency and also ensure that the measure does not result in a net increase in general fund costs. So that concludes my remarks. Happy to take any questions you might have.
Okay. Before I allow my colleagues to ask questions, especially for the people in the audience, this is probably a normal process for the Department of Finance and the LAO not always to agree on a number. I mean, I think since we've been in the legislature, I don't think we've ever agreed on the surpluses that are in the budget every year. We're usually higher than the governor's office. So the legislature and the governor's office aren't always together, even though I think this year we're a lot closer than we ever have before since I've been here. So this is not unusual to have that. What I would like, and I think the rest of the committee members would like, for us to proceed in a logical, kind of systematic, methodical procedure where we look at where we agree. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like we agree on anything, but that's a whole nother discussion. But $100 million is a big delta. I mean, that's a big number that we're apart, and so I'm hopefully that we can begin to lead the discussion into where we agree or where we can come to compromise, so that we can ultimately get the most, as I heard from a lot of the people that testified, we can get to the most transparent methodology that everyone's comfortable with. We may not have full agreement, but we may get to a comfort level that that we are abiding by the full spirit of Prop 47. I worry that we proceed and people are getting the wrong impression of how we proceed, and that we're not doing all we can to provide the services that we promised when this bill was approved, and that we're not doing anything crazy or it's not one of those things where, you know, one group says $1 for you, $1 for you, $1 for me, half a cent for you, $3 for me, and $1 for you. Hopefully, it doesn't look like that, and that we eventually are able to get to where we need to go. I have a couple of questions, but I'll hold off, because I know Mr. Lackey's been waiting with some questions, so I'll let him begin if he's ready.